Hello, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. I'm your host, Joe Firestone. And our topics for tonight are enforced silence, Endgames in Ukraine and Gaza. And Mexico says to the United States, stop interfering. So I see Dee is here. Hello, Dee. How are you? And Steve Wolfbrand is here. Hi, Steve. Great to see you as well. It looks like things are filling in very quickly now. I'm going to start then with the first of our topics, enforced silence. And that one is based on an article called The Sound of Enforced Silence by Patrick Lawrence. He wrote this on August 29, 2024. It's quite a long piece, about 2,800 words. Very powerful, very powerful. There's a picture of the Democratic Convention, of course, with the Kamala sign. Or should I say Kamala sign? Sorry about that. Balloons fall after Vice President Kamala Harris's speech at the Democratic National Convention. The photo is by Chris Bentley. It's licensed under CC by 2.0. Is there some connection? He starts off. Not quite official, but it may as well be, between censorship and presidential politics. I pose the question as a survivor of the Russiagate years when illiberal liberals started talking about, quote, free speech absolutists, unquote. And when corporate journalists cheered the censoring of unincorporated journalists, so long as it was called, quote, content moderation. I cannot answer my own question, honestly, but as this November's elections draw near, a new and aggressive campaign to suppress dissent in social media, at airports, on campuses, and elsewhere is hard upon us. This is a transatlantic, transnational operation. Let us not fail to take note. Straight off the top, you probably noticed that the Democratic Party's openly undemocratic elite refused to allow any speaker of Palestinian background to address the convention in Chicago last week. We can read this, disgraceful in itself, as an indication of how the Democrats intend to deal with the Gaza crisis and other such foreign policy matters if they succeed in extending their power another 4 years. Yes, they will continue supporting terrorist Israel and the Nazi-infested regime in Ukraine, just as they have to date, but they will avoid talking to you and me about the Imperium's gruesome business as they conduct it. Silence on such matters will be as gold to these people, especially between now and November 5th. Kamala Harris, or the cynical operatives busily inventing Kamala Harris, maybe he should have said they're reinventing, are selling, quote, joy, unquote, this political season, not any kind of sober, responsible view of our circumstances. Harris is supposed to ride in the White House on a carpet of good vibes. Gaza, the war in Ukraine, Washington's provocations at the other end of the Pacific. Nah, all such questions are bad vibes. One of the things the Russiagate years exposed was the close collaboration between the Democratic Party and the national security state. People who know their history have long understood that, quote, the intelligence community, unquote, so odious this term, has been from its beginnings in the late 1940s more liberal than conservative in its culture and sensibilities. Hillary Clinton's embarrassing defeat in 2016 consolidated this relationship. It is now hard to tell where the Democratic Party ends and the national security state begins. I have been, since the Russiagate years, perfectly comfortable with the term, quote, deep state, unquote. And here it comes again, reliant as always upon its appendages in the big tech social media platforms and the more repellent quadrants of corporate media, as they attempt to distinguish all other than approved opinions and perspectives. Of the many recent incidents of censorship, suppression, and intimidation, the one that got me to the keyboard concerns Sharmeen Narwani, who founded 3 years ago this month an online journal of news and content called The Cradle, as in, quote, the cradle of civilization, unquote. Narwani, based in Beirut, now writes columns regularly and edits features for the English language version of the site. She calls The Cradle a collective effort, quote, an online magazine covering the geopolitics of West Asia from within the region, unquote. These last four words, from within the region, that is, I add, are the words that matter most to me. Last week, on the first day of the Democratic National Convention, indeed, Meta permanently banned The Cradle from Facebook and Instagram, the holding company's most trafficked social media properties. That's Meta, for those who don't know, is the holding company for Facebook, okay, and Instagram. Narwani now stands accused of, quote, praising terrorist organizations, unquote, and engaging in, quote, incitement to violence, unquote. This ruling came without warning. All Narwani got was this: your account or activity on it does not follow our community guidelines. No one can see or find your account, and you can't use it. All your information will be permanently deleted. You cannot request a review of this decision. How's this for the sound of liberal authoritarianism? Big Brother could not have got down the poetry of fascistic finality any better. Narwani, who earned a master's degree at Columbia University in International Affairs before joining the great craft, by which he means the journalism, of course, writes forthrightly and without regard for however much her reporting may shock the comfortably misinformed. Hers is not the stuff of beach reading, which is where its strength lies. Narwani's investigations at the height of the CIA's covert operation in Syria were especially distinguished but proved simply too honest for the American media of the New York Times, The Guardian, Salon, and so on to continue taking. When Huffington Post stopped accepting her work, it scrubbed her entire archive. Oh boy. I published a long two-part interview with Narwani in 2019, shortly before she seems to have concluded very wisely that there is no getting truthful reporting of her kind into a mainstream media scene wholly given over to the imperialist propaganda machine. It was Narwani who first taught me that, quote, the Middle East, unquote, is better understood as, quote, West Asia, unquote. I saw in the cradle's pages, in other words, the true power of perspective when it is decentered, or better put, properly recentered. Losing alternative perspectives is precisely what is at stake in this new round of censorship. Narwani wrote last week, the italics are hers. Uh, but Meta's accusations of the cradle, quote, praising terrorist organizations, unquote, and engaging in, quote, incitement to violence, unquote, largely stem from posts and videos that relay information or quotes from West Asian resistance movements like Hamas, Hezbollah, okay, and Ansarallah, blacklisted by many Western governments who are an essential part of the news stories unfolding in a region on the precipice of a major war. It is also essential to recognize that these are major West Asian political organizations that have deep institutional and civic roots within Lebanon, Palestine, and Yemen, and are part of the very fabric of these societies. They are represented in governance, run schools, hospitals, and utilities, and disperse salaries to millions of civilian workers. I'm very pleased Narwani made this important point. We lose all such density of understanding when power, political power, also media power, big tech power, affixes the label, quote, terrorist, unquote, to an organization, a person, or a group of people, or are thenceforth rendered two-dimensional, while we are rendered ignorant, precisely the intended state. And in this new wave of censorship, the drift is that journalists, too, can be accused of terrorists or of acting as their accomplices. Just as I was thinking through Meta's permanent ban of the cradle, I came a little late to the case of Andrew Napolitano, who in a previous life was a Superior Court judge sitting on the New Jersey bench. Judge N's daily webcast, Judging Freedom, has become must viewing in my household and many others, but by the numbers. I have to admit that Judge N's daily webcasts, plural, have become also must viewing in my household. But Judge Napolitano has a gift for clipped, succinct questions that call forth the insightful replies of an extraordinary list of returning guests: Ray McGovern, Chaz Freedom, Jeffrey Sachs, Alistair Crook, John Mearsheimer, Larry Johnson. These are top drawer names, all of them unwelcome in corporate media. He might also have added Scott Ritter and also Colonel McGregor as well. Okay. And Phil Giraldi, for that matter, too, and Lieutenant Colonel Karen Kwiatkowski as well. I'm sure I've forgotten someone. The censors arrived in June when YouTube, a Google property, took a segment of Judge Napolitano's program off the air and assigned it a, quote, first strike, unquote. Yet 3 of these, and YouTube, long distinguished as one of the most aggressive censors of dissenting opinion, will remove your webcast permanently with meta-style courtesy. When I asked Judge Napolitano about this the other day, he replied in a note, "We were told by YT, with no notice, that the strike was due to an on-air conversation that I had with a guest back in June of this year. The 20-second conversation addressed the well-known and well-documented origins of the Ukrainian Azov battalion and the propensity of many of its members to bear swastika tattoos. The same subject has been addressed in the New York Times and on CNN and elsewhere. YT called it hate speech. We ran it through standard and expected AI platforms and all concluded that this was not hate speech. Of course, Google agreed with its offspring. There are a couple of things to note about this. Three, now that I think of it. One is by now tiresome in the extreme to have people in the propaganda apparatus pretending there are no neo-Nazis active in Ukraine when the Kyiv regime is shot through with them and when Azov and other groups, driven by a visceral hatred of Russia and its people, lead the most effective battalions in the armed forces of Ukraine. As I and numerous others have pointed out, and as Judge Napolitano suggests, the country's neo-Nazi elements have appeared and disappeared in mainstream Western media according to passing geopolitical exigencies. Judge N got paddled for making reference to common knowledge. I guess I have to add to that paragraph that even though I'm not sure which video it was, from the sound of things, I would be at least somewhat certain to say that it was probably a conversation Judge Napolitano was having with Scott Ritter, because he constantly talks about the Azovs, the neo-Nazi elements in it, and the origin and the Stefan Bandera movement in the Ukraine. That is to say, the group of people responsible for Babi Yar, among other terrible atrocities in the eastern part of Europe in World War II. Two, when we consider the caliber of Judge Napolitano's regular guests, we have to conclude that the operators of the censorship machine are shifting gears. Oh, I know who I forgot from Judge Napolitano's shows, specifically Max Blumenthal, Aaron Mate, and Anya Parenpil. Probably the most lefty of all his guests. How could I do that? What has been, until now, a somewhat spotty swatting flies operation shapes up to be a pervasive threat to free speech and the right to dissenting opinion from which not even our most distinguished minds, are immune. Finally, I will take this opportunity to assert that the notion of what, quote, hate speech, unquote, and all efforts to outlaw it are wholly objectionable in any society purporting to be democratic and come to, at the horizon, nothing short of thought control. Contempt may be a noble sentiment, but hatred is an altogether human emotion, and we all have a right to it. Now, the Germans, who are way ahead of Americans in this line, are a good indicator of where the suppression of, quote, hate speech, unquote, leads. It leads to a polity that no longer knows itself because its people, fearful of prison or fines, no longer live their lives, so to say, publicly. All becomes furtive. When Scott Ritter was pulled off a plane in June, just as he began a journey to St. Petersburg, Russia, to attend an annual conference, the St. Petersburg Economic Conference, by the way, it was obvious there was a degree of performance or demonstration in the conduct of the New York police and the State Department which authorized the operation. Ritter, once a UN weapons inspector and now a commentator on military and foreign affairs, and once also a Marine, a U.S. Marine, a fact that he is very proud of and always referring to, had his passport confiscated and cannot for the moment travel. State could have got this done without all the theater at the Kennedy Airport. Who knew at the time where this would lead? Who knew it was the front edge of an effort to intimidate journalists of various kinds with the direct threat of prison on charges of terrorism or working as an agent of a foreign power, or who knows what. Earlier this month, while Ritter um, uh, um, was marooned in his suburb, of Albany, the FBI raided his home and removed all his electronic communication devices, along with many crates of documents. As the Times subsequently reported, this part of an investigation into whether Ritter acts as a foreign agent when he writes for RT International, which is Russia's equivalent to the BBC, or participates in some of RT's broadcasts. The operative statute is the Foreign Agents Registration Act, and the question at issue is whether Ritter transgressed when he failed to register as an agent of the Russian Federation. Quote, more searches are expected soon, unquote, the Times reported, citing officials. Quote, criminal charges are also possible, unquote. Now, just a damn minute, says Patrick Lawrence. More searches? Criminal charges? When the BBC's U.S. correspondents are similarly investigated, unthinkable, of course, I will take this invocation of Farah seriously. I'll add to that. When Israel's U.S. correspondents are similarly investigated, unthinkable, of course, I will take this invocation of Farah seriously. But our censors, as the record shows again and again, have no special concern about acting in a serious matter. Power has no such obligation. I must now fear for people such as Chris Hedges, who had a program in RT America before the U.S. government effectively shut the network down, and at which point YouTube deleted the 6-year archive of Hedges' RT America program, quote, on Contact. I have my own views of the wisdom or otherwise of working for RT International, if not RT America, which in practice served as a haven for dissident Americans of various stripes. But we'll set these thoughts aside for now. The idea that High Hedges, top to bottom a professional, the whole of his career could get marked down as a foreign agent is simply preposterous. Did I say, quote, preposterous? I come to the case of Richard Medhurst. Medhurst, born in Syria and a British subject, has an enviable knowledge of West Asian affairs and is a vigorously outspoken critic of Zionist Israel's terrorizing campaign. I think he should have said genociding campaign against the Palestinians of Gaza. Traveling through London last week, he resides in Vienna. Medhurst was not detained at Heathrow. He was arrested and held in solitary for nearly 24 hours under Article 12 of Britain's Terrorism Act. He's not been charged with any crime, and I reckon he won't be, so farcical is this exercise. But he will remain under investigation for 3 months. Here is Hedges on the Medhurst case, and I hope he will forgive the ellipses I have added to the quotation. Quote, the arrest of the reporter, Richard Medhurst, who has been one of the most ardent critics of the genocide in Gaza and Israeli apartheid state, is part of the steady march towards the criminalization of journalism. It is designed to have a chilling effect on reporting that elucidates Israel's genocidal campaign, there it is, in Gaza, and increasingly the West Bank, as well as the active collaboration, this extermination of the Palestinian people by the US and UK governments. If we do not vigorously oppose his arrest, if we do not denounce the use of terrorism laws to silence journalists, Medhurst's arrest will become the, quote, norm, unquote. There is more where all this comes from. John Kiriakou, a CIA whistleblower who was convicted of exposing the CIA's torture program, was recently escorted to his connecting flight in Toronto and detained in Washington as he flew home from Athens via Canada. Quote, there's no good news in these stories, unquote. Kiriakou writes in a review of his and other cases in a consortium news piece titled, published Tuesday under the headline, quote, the slide into authoritarianism, unquote. Quote, again, this is the future unless we stand up to fight it. My mind drifts back to the Democratic National Convention, says Patrick Lawrence, as I consider these events. I think of all those dreamy, worshipful faces, eyes uplifted, to which the cameras turned in the course of the speeches delivered by various party elites, and of course, Kamala Harris, when she formally accepted her nomination last Thursday evening. How innocently eager they seem to have someone they can believe in. How lost they were to the world as it is all around them, and how cynical the illiberal liberals who run the party as they manipulate the emotions of these people while condemning them to ignorance of the imperium the party is committed to sustaining. Edward Luce, formerly the Financial Times' Washington bureau chief and now one of the FT's most readable commentators, ran a column on the convention under the headline, quote, Gaza, unquote, I should say, quote, Gaza, unquote, is the word Democrats dare not whisper in Chicago, unquote. One day into the proceedings, The Intercept put out an item entitled, quote, Democratic Party unites under banner of silence on Gaza genocide, unquote. That is how it was, more or less, at the DNC in Chicago. There was plenty of talk of AIPAC, the anti-democratic American Israel Public Affairs Committee, a foreign agent if ever there was one, but only in the streets outside the convention hall. Harris finally raised the Gaza crisis during her acceptance speech, but boy, oh, did she blow through that topic with haste. This was, quote, strategic vagueness, unquote, an adorable phrase the New York Times has coined to make a virtue of Harris's weather-vane vacuousness at its very finest. It was the usual thing when Harris devoted a few sentences to Gaza. Her White House will shed more crocodile tears for the suffering of Palestinians, but the unwavering, unconditional support the, quote, Biden-Harris administration, unquote, extends to apartheid Israel will remain unwavering and unconditional. When you hear Harris say, quote, I will always stand up for Israel's right to defend itself, unquote, as she stated last Thursday, it is the recipient of AIPAC funds speaking in the code the Israel lobby understands, and now, okay, in italics from Patrick, worry not, you will get what you have paid for. My take, it will be silence on the Imperium's doings between now and November 5th. And if Harris is elected in November, getting her through the following 4 years will require an escalated version of the censorship regime the national security state and big tech imposed on dissenting voices during the Trump years, but with one difference. The objective then was to take down our 45th president. This time it will be to sustain our stunningly unqualified 47th president. Now, I love this article, or most of this article. I was so glad of the frankness of it and the accurate analysis of it. But perhaps the one place where I disagree is where he says, this time it will be to sustain our stunningly unqualified 47th president. The reason why I say that is because our 46th president was stunningly unqualified. Our 45th president, the sainted Mr. Obama, had only a few years under his belt as a senator when he ran for and was elected for president. One might say that he was fairly unqualified as well. George Bush, or I should say George W. Bush, when he ran for the presidency in the year 2000, had only been the governor of Texas, a state where the governor doesn't have a lot of power and where he hardly did anything. But he ran as the nominee of the Republican Party. Al Gore refused to accept the help in the campaign, of Bill Clinton. And then the Supreme Court, of course, took away the election from Al Gore. No, it was not Ralph Nader who took away the election from Al Gore. I'm sorry. It was not the Supreme Court. It was Al Gore himself. Okay. Anyway, my point is that many of our presidents since the reign, of Lyndon Johnson, well, I should say since the reign of Richard Nixon, have not been powerfully qualified, for the presidency. And here I include Jimmy Carter, and Ronald Reagan, and Bill Clinton. I don't think that any of them were more qualified necessarily than Harris is. In any case, I think this final statement, is a debatable point. But apart from this statement, I think this was a magnificent piece, warning us that something very important is happening right now, and it is the suppression of the free speech that has been enjoyed by the left for so long. Now, of course, Trump is running around claiming now, or his partisans, such as RFKJ, are objecting to the obvious attempts by the Harris campaign to work on suppressing free speech. There was an incident on Twitter today, to that effect. But really anticipating that Trump is going to refrain from trying to suppress free speech when he is the president and he's getting a barrage of critical articles against him, that in his second term he's going to refrain from this. I'm not saying look over there now. What I am saying is that we do not care for free speech in this country anymore. It has seen better days, and we all better fight to save it. And even though we have to fight hard to save free speech from a government that is intent on suppressing it, we also have to fight hard to save free speech at the social media platforms that pretend, to allow it, but of course who have been instrumental in suppressing free speech on their platform for years now. And I don't exempt the platform of X and Elon Musk from this. They're touting themselves as the brave directors of free speech right now. But obviously, any one of those who have used Twitter for a while and who have been dedicated, to dissent, knows that Twitter has suppressed the growth of certain people who are on that particular platform. Anyway, that's all I have to say about that particular piece. It warns very powerfully against a trend which is very, very important. Now, let us take a look at some of your comments on that, see where you are. Steve Wolpran says, realistically, our choice is Harris or Trump. It's what they gave us. You are correct, Steve. You are very, very correct. Those are our realistic choices. But if we have states, if we have a situation in states which are safe either for Harris or for Trump, then in those states we are free to vote for third parties in an attempt to build up those third parties so they get a high enough percentage of the vote that they may have an easier time getting on ballots in 28. We have to build, in other words, for the future where we can. On the other hand, where it's a close race between the two parties, we will have to make that choice, either one, or the other. A classic sort of lesser of two evils choice. Going on, I'll move to the second of our topics tonight. There are 32 people here. I'm very happy to see that, of course. Okay, that is very good. This next piece is one by a former member of Jill Stein's Green Shadow Cabinet, 2016. Specifically, Jack Rasmus is his name. Mostly I've seen him writing on the economy, but this is a very good piece on foreign policy. This is called, I picked it up in LA Progressive, and this is called The Tale of Two Offensives, Endgames in the Ukraine War, unquote. Well, Russia has a clear, albeit not overwhelming edge in combat forces in Ukraine today. But military success is not just a function of absolute numbers. This was written by Jack Rasmus on August 27, 2024, so I've been holding it for a while. The caption on the picture says, "War, it sucks. But let's keep fighting so someone can win." Here, Natalie Severukova mourns the loss of her home in Kiev. This is from Sky News. Ukraine war is at a crossroads. It is entering a new phase. Excuse me a second while I take a little tea. And I remind myself, it's also time for me to take a couple of my pills. I think we all have pills we must take from time to time, at least those of us who are at an advanced age. It is not the worst thing in the world. As Bonnie smiles at me while I take these pills. Oh, by the way, today was the 58th wedding anniversary of Bonnie and I. And we did go out to dinner to celebrate. So, both Ukraine and Russia have opened new fronts and offenses. Ukraine in the northern Kursk border region, and Russia in the Kharkov and central Donbass area of Donetsk. Further new fronts are likely. It is estimated that Russia's total forces in Ukraine ranges today, late summer 2024, are between 600,000 per Ukraine and 700,000 per the Russia Ministry of Defense. Ukraine's total available forces are around 350,000. Behind these numbers, however, both sides are mobilizing further additional forces not yet committed to the line of combat Ukraine is hurriedly recruiting and training another 150,000. Well, Russia reportedly has another 400,000 in its total armed forces located elsewhere in Russia. Russia additionally plans to have an army of 1.4 million by year end, which suggests additional combat reserves of perhaps 300,000 in addition to its 700,000 um, 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 combat brigades now in Ukraine. So Russia today has a roughly 2-to-1 numerical superiority in both combat troops in Ukraine, as well as potential reserves. What a Russia force of 700,000 Ukraine today and even 1 million by year end means is that Russia's special military operation is simply not a sufficient force to conquer all of Ukraine, nor was it ever intended to be when Russia in February 2022 entered Ukraine with an SMO combat force of less than 100,000. With combat forces even at 1 million by year end, short of an unlikely total collapse of Ukraine's army, I don't know if that's unlikely, by the way. I think that's likely. But putting that aside, the SMO is not sufficient to take Kyiv, okay, or Odessa. And it's certainly not sufficient to invade NATO, as some war hawks in the West like to argue in order to justify more direct NATO involvement in the war. By way of historical comparison, it took the Soviet Union a 13 million man army to push the Nazis out of its territory, at least a third or 4 million of which were engaged in its southern Ukrainian front alone. While Russia has a clear, albeit not overwhelming, edge in combat forces in Ukraine today, uh, 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 military success is not just a function of absolute numbers, but of how well forces can be concentrated at a given front to enable a numerical advantage for a time over one's adversary. Other factors play a tactical role as well, like the element of surprise, the quantity and quality of reserves that can be marshaled at critical points and times in the conflict, the mobility of one's forces to be quickly deployed, and the ability to deceive one's opponent as to where, when, and how much force will be concentrated. While important and even at times decisive, these latter factors, reserve, surprise, uh, uh, mobility, etc., are nonetheless secondary. Concentration of force is always the primary military tactic. And so far, we have seen both Ukraine and Russia concentrate their respective forces, albeit in different fronts separated by hundreds of kilometers. The question is, which front is strategically the more important? The key strategic event of 2024, the key event of the war this summer in 2024, is Russia's concentration of numerically and qualitatively superior forces in the central Donbass area. Russia has enjoyed a numerical advantage in combat forces in the Donbass, as well as in air superiority and missile artillery forces for at least the past years since the collapse of Ukraine's summer 2023 offensive. This Russian advantage and superiority in Donbass has been further increased this summer of 2024 as a result of Ukraine's withdrawal from Donbass this summer of some of its best brigades. Ukraine sent these best brigades from the Donbass to the North Kursk border region to participate on August the 6th in Ukraine's invasion of Russia's Kursk territory. That shift of Ukraine forces left its Donbass front weakly defended. In contrast, Russia has not shifted any of its forces from Donbass to the Kursk front, but has increased its forces in Donbass. This event is perhaps the single most strategic shift in the war this summer 2024. Which front and offensive, Ukraine's Kursk or Russia's Donbass, is more important for the eventual outcome of the war will likely be decided in the coming months and definitely before year end 2024. In the battles now underway in these two fronts, the Kursk and Donbass, we may in effect be witnessing the beginning of the end game of the war in Ukraine. I have to add here that increasingly, and this continues to happen since the 27th of August, okay, when this was written, increasingly the Russians are rolling up the Ukrainians, in Kursk. Their counterattacks, are devastating, and the losses of life in Kursk on the Ukrainian side are rather stunning, at this point. And if I'm not mistaken, uh, the killed per day in both the Donbass, and Kursk are now over the 2,000 fatality mark uh, uh, for the Ukrainians, who are already at the short end of the numerical stick. As a result of Ukraine's withdrawals of some of its best brigades from the Donbass, Russian forces are now having increasing success on that front, taking village after village, driving west toward the key Ukraine's strongholds of Pokrovsk in central Donbass, as well as toward Slavyansk in northern Donbass. Should Russia take them both, the war in eastern Ukraine will be effectively over, at least in those former provinces, Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson in eastern Ukraine. The line of combat will almost certainly then move quickly far to the west, to the Dnieper River. In contrast, it's difficult to see what strategically Ukraine hopes to achieve by its penetration into Russia's Kursk province. Will it turn the tide of the war in favor of Ukraine? That is highly unlikely, given Russia's continuing advantage in combat forces, weapons, and air superiority, which raises the question: what were Ukraine's motives and objectives for its Kursk offensive, and can it attain them? And the next section is on Ukraine's Kursk summer offensive, launched on August 6, 2024. Ukraine's Kursk offensive has had some initial success. Ukraine initially concentrated numerically superior forces at the Kursk border, as it had earlier in the summer at the Kharkov border, southeast of Kursk. In the run-up to its August Kursk offensive, Ukraine publicly announced its troop concentrations opposite Kursk and north of Kharkov city were strictly defensive moves to prepare for expected Russian invasions from the north, which were being rumored to be imminent throughout the spring 2024. In hindsight, however, Ukraine's announcement that its forces at the Kharkov and the Kursk borders were strictly defensive appears to have been a military defensive, but Ukraine's military recently revealed that Ukraine had been preparing back in June for an offensive into Russia at Kursk. The question then arises: what were Ukraine's motives and objectives moving troops from the Donbass and other areas of Ukraine, also from the Belarus-Ukraine border, and concentrating them on its northern Kharkov and Kursk border? If it was not for defense against the new Russian offensive in the north, but to launch an offensive of its own, what were and are Ukraine's objectives? In preparation for its Kursk offensive this August, Ukraine transferred combat brigades from all over Ukraine and concentrated them at the Kursk border in July, including many of its best brigades in Donbass, as well as some of its 95,000 in defensive positions at the Kharkov border. Ukraine reportedly even moved troops from the Belarus border to Kursk, enabled apparently by an agreement, with Belarus to reduce their respective forces from the Belarus-Ukraine border, an agreement that reportedly has been recently rescinded. Finally, Ukraine also rushed some of its new drafted recruits with minimal training to its Kursk region in preparation for the Kursk offensive as well. In short, Ukraine moved up to a third of its total brigades to the Kursk region. That's probably around 150,000, perhaps half of which are actual combat brigades. A reduced force was left at Vovchansk and a seriously depleted force in the Donbass. In addition, some Ukraine brigades reportedly have returned to the Belarus border since the August offensive. With a mass combat force of around 70,000, Ukraine easily overwhelmed Russia's thinly guarded Kursk border, which was manned with border yards and other untested units. even though Ukraine invaded Kursk initially with 12,000 or so. Since August 6th, it has brought up and concentrated at least another 60,000 or so. This perhaps suggests Ukraine is not finished crossing the border into Russia elsewhere along the northern border. Some analysts suggest Ukraine plans to open another offensive further northwest of Kursk in what's called the Bryansk border region, or alternatively just southwest of Kursk in the Belgorod border region. There's even some rumor of another offensive in the far southwest of Zaporozhye province by Ukraine, targeting the taking of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant currently under Russian control, where Ukraine might be successful in marshaling such additional weather. They might be successful in marshaling such additional combat forces is debatable. However, in response, Russia initially brought in special forces and Marines to check Ukraine's advance, which has slowed significantly. And reportedly, mechanized forces are en route to the Kursk front from other locations in Russia. The Kursk pocket has now become the most intense killing field of the war to date. What the Kursk and other possible Ukraine offensives in front suggests is that Ukraine is desperate to get Russia to shift its superior and increasingly effective forces from the Donbass in order to slow Russia's accelerating advances there. But so far, it appears Russia has not done so. Russia's Kharkov of Chansk offensive. There's another parallel story here. Before Ukraine's August offensive into Kursk, Russian forces in early May had entered Ukraine's Kharkov province near the Ukrainian border city of Volchansk, located just 25 miles north of Ukraine's second largest city of Kharkov. That Russian offensive was launched with a small force of only 15 to 20,000, even though Russia knew Ukraine had concentrated 95,000 troops in a defensive line just south of the border. The result was predictable. The Russian offensive into Kharkov became quickly bogged down, and a stalemate resulted there around the city of Volchansk, at least until very recently. The second parallel question, therefore, arises: why did Russia cross the border near Kharkov of Volchansk with such an insufficient concentration of forces, facing off against what it knew were reportedly 95,000 Ukrainian troops dug in defensive positions? Clearly, the objective could not have been to take Kharkov city, so then what was it? The next section is Russia's Donbass offensive. The most important strategic military development this summer 2024 in the war is not Ukraine's invasion at Kursk. It is that to enable its Kursk offensive, Ukraine has left its Donbass front seriously weakened. So weak, in fact, that Russia's offensive in the Donbass is intensifying almost daily, which, by the way, it continues to intensify since August the 27th, with growing success. There are three directions in which Russia is driving west in the Donbass. The most important is the central Donbass, where Russia is virtually at the gates of the strategic hub Ukrainian city of Pokrovsk. Pokrovsk is a railway and road intersection that feeds Ukraine forces, most of its weapons and supplies, to central and southern Donbass. If it falls to Russia, supplies to most of its forces in central Donbass are at great risk. Equally important, west of Pokrovsk, there are a few lines and fortifications for Ukraine defense operations. The road is open to the Dnieper River to the far west, the next natural line of defense by Ukraine. But the Dnieper represents the loss of all of Donetsk province, and it's a complete liberation by Russia. Some would say, not me, but some would say, it's complete conquest by Russia. Just further north of Pokrovsk lies the similarly strategic city of Slavyansk and its neighboring largest city of Kramatorsk. Slavyansk is the analog in terms of Ukraine logistical support for the northern Donbass. If it too falls, so too does all the remainder of northern Donbass and Luhansk province. Russian advances have also begun in this region through Siversk, and Izium. In short, if Pokrovsk and Slavyansk fall to Russia, it's game over in the Donbass front, to Ukraine. Russia advance suggests this is likely before the U.S. November elections or soon after. The point is Ukraine's withdrawal of some of its best forces from Donbass to its Kursk front uh, has no doubt accelerated Russia's gains now underway in the Donbass. And if Donbass falls, Ukraine has no choice but to exit its positions further south at the Zaporozhye border as well, or else be encircled there. The events in recent months in Donbass thus raises yet a third strategic question. Has Ukraine effectively decided to sacrifice the Donbass in order to launch its Kursk offensive? Military analysts on both sides seem uncertain as to why Ukraine and Russia have made the decisions they have at this critical juncture of the war in summer 2024. Russia last May in Kharkov, Ukraine this summer in Donbass, and today Kursk, and Russia's decision to hold firm to its offensive in Donbass. So what are some of the possible explanations being bandied about by analysts trying to explain these objectives of these two offensives? Ukraine and Kursk and Russia in Kharkov, Donbass. Some unanswered strategic questions. Let's summarize these questions and offer some possible answers. Question one: why did Ukraine invade Kursk? What are its possible objectives, and can it attain those objectives? Okay, so some military analysts are all over the map with speculation as to why Ukraine invaded Kursk. Some say the objective was to seize the Russian nuclear power plant located just south of the city of Kursk and less than 100 miles from the border. By seizing the plant, Ukraine would then use it as a blackmail piece in trying to negotiate with Russia. Yet another objective raised is that Ukraine intends to use the territory captured as a bargaining chip when it finally negotiates with Russia, which it appears several third parties have been trying to arrange, albeit thus far without success. In terms of military tactics, still another speculation goes. The Ukrainian invasion was intended to force Russia to transfer brigades from its Donbass front to Kursk and thereby slow down Russia's advances in the Donbass that appeared to be accelerating. Yet another speculation is Russia intended to create a Ukraine intended to create a buffer zone along the border before Russia launched its own offensive into Ukraine and the region. That suggests the Ukrainian invasion was to preempt Russia opening an offensive front of its own along the northern border. And still another view is that the true objective of Ukraine's offensive has been to make Putin appear weak to Russian elites and public who are now demanding a more aggressive Russian response to the invasion. The Kursk offensive, according to this view, is to provoke Russia to a more extreme aggressive response that would enable Zelensky to receive more lethal military aid from NATO, like the UK Storm Shadow and US ATACMS, those missiles, and missiles carrying F-16s, and NATO permission to use them to attack deep inside Russia. Okay, by the way, the F-16s look like they're going to be a dud, at least according to Colonel McGregor and Scott Ritter. Already one of them has been destroyed, by Russia. I don't think they have that many, maybe 16 or 20 or something like that. Okay, and they are old frames transferred from European stocks. Very old frames, maybe dating from the 1980s or something like that. When you're flying with old frames that have not been refurbished, and reinforced, you're at a severe disadvantage in combat. It doesn't seem like the F-16s can engage in dogfights, with Russian planes. they have to stand off and use missiles to attack at a distance. If that's the case, they're not going to do much to decrease the air superiority, of the Russians, in the area. Also, the Russians have their own missile-carrying planes, which are much newer, and very capable, and which also can attack at a distance, and will likely be attacking the air bases at which the F-16s are stationed. Going on, it's possible the little of all the above motivations for Ukraine's offensive. So far as seizing the Kursk the nuclear plant is concerned, if that were the objective, it has been neutralized, and Ukraine has virtually no chance of reaching the Kursk plant any longer now that massive Russian defenses now block its path. The explanation that the Kursk offensive's objective is to force Russia to move some military units from Donbass to Kursk has also apparently failed to date. Russia has sufficient reserves elsewhere in Russia proper and is moving those to the Kursk front. Speculation is that Zelensky authorized the Kursk offensive as a, quote, land-for-land, unquote, bargaining chip in future negotiations, is also negated by recent events since August 6th. Putin has publicly stated there'll be no negotiations with Ukraine so long as its forces remain on Russian territory, whether in Kursk or Donbass. The idea of Ukraine obtaining a buffer has never been convincing. Why would Ukraine deplete its military resources elsewhere and risk losing more territory in Donbass in order to protect the territory along the north border it hadn't even lost yet? It seems, therefore, the most likely objective of the Ukraine-Kursk offensive was and remains political, to provoke Russia into extreme response in order for Ukraine to restore fading Western support for Ukraine to continue the war. Zelensky needs Russia to escalate to remain in power in Ukraine. Throughout, NATO support is waning for providing arms and ammunition to Ukraine. The West further believes that funding Ukraine's war and economy is settled, provided by the seized $300 billion of Russian assets. However, Western media almost daily has become increasingly critical of the war, recognizing it cannot be won. But Zelensky thus needs to show Ukraine still has the ability to fight, and NATO needs to provide even more weaponry because Russia is escalating the war. Zelensky realizes he needs more direct NATO troop involvement, not just the weaponry. Currently, NATO is participating in ground operations with technicians operating advanced NATO weapons, also mercenaries, as well as senior NATO officers and war planners on the ground. It will need even more. It can't impress NATO to provide more by losses in the Donbass, but it might convince NATO war hawks to do so by offensive into Russia, like Kursk. 2. Has Ukraine effectively decided to sacrifice Donbass? Evidence on the ground strongly suggests Ukraine may have decided to sacrifice territory in the Donbass and perhaps the entire region altogether. Its Donbass defense was beginning to crack well before the Kursk offensive, ever since the loss of the strategic Donbass city of Avdiivka earlier this year. Now losses there are accelerating after Ukraine pulled some of its best forces from Donbass and moved them to Kursk. For Ukraine, the northern Kursk front is strategically more important than Donbass. Its bargaining position in eventual future negotiations with Russia and Western support in general was weakening so long as it was losing Donbass. Seizing Russian territory in the north might shore up that loss of support and strengthen its position. In short, protecting Kharkov city and Ukraine territory outside Russia's 4 provinces in the east is strategically more important to Ukraine than holding on to the Donbass. But Ukraine can hold on to the Donbass in the end, and NATO and Ukraine both know it. Opinion in the West increasingly suggests Ukraine should agree to give up Donbass and the 4 provinces. but Ukraine cannot simply retreat in the Donbass and give it up without appearing weak or as about to lose the war. That would accelerate NATO withdrawal of support. Zelensky therefore needed another success elsewhere if Ukraine was inevitably about to lose Donbass. Thus, the Kursk offensive. 3. Why did Russia invade Kharkov region with an insufficient force? Russia crossed over the border early last May in the Kharkov region, but not to capture the large Ukraine city of Kharkov. That would take perhaps a Russian offensive force of at least 500,000. Russia obviously knew, moreover, that a large Ukrainian force of up to 95,000 per reports was concentrated between the borders and Kharkov city itself, barely 50 miles away to the south. So why then did Russia open that front with only 15 to 20,000 troops? The only possible explanation is Russia entered Kharkov with an insufficient force to get Ukraine to withdraw forces from the Donbass to protect Kharkov, which it did. Otherwise, the explanation for throwing a force of 15,000 and 90,000 was military folly, and there's no evidence throughout the war that Russia has been militarily foolish in its offensive force deployments. Did Russia get caught by surprise by the Kursk invasion? It has to be admitted Russia was clearly caught off guard by Ukraine's Kursk offensive. It might have been misled by Ukraine's deception that its amassing forces on the Ukraine side of the Kursk border in the summer was strictly defensive, designed to confront Russia should it have itself invaded at that location. It is also possible Russia may have viewed the U.S. NATO limitations to date on Ukraine's use of ATACMS and cruise missiles to attack deep inside Russia as evidence. Ukraine was not allowed by NATO U.S. to escalate attacks directly into Russia. Before August 6th, Ukraine's attacking inside Russia was limited to Ukrainian drones. Russia may have interpreted these NATO limits meant Ukraine would not be given the green light, quote unquote, to cross the Russian border with large ground forces. This, combined with Russia misreading Ukraine's concentration of forces on its side of the border as only defensive, may have led Russia to erroneously assume Ukraine would not mount an offensive into Kursk. 5. Are we witnessing the growing importance of reserves in the war? As the war now has passed its 2.5-year mark, it is clearly beginning to wear on both sides in terms of men and materiel. The availability of sufficient reserves is therefore beginning to play a relatively more important role as the war has continued. Not just reserves in the sense of the number of available combat troops, but their combat experience, training, and availability of weapons and ammunition are becoming an increasingly critical factor in the conduct of the war. This is often the case in war as the conflict becomes contracted, except when one side has an overwhelming force advantage over the other. That may have been the case in U.S. wars in Iraq, Libya, Yugoslavia, Panama, and elsewhere, but it wasn't in Vietnam and it isn't in Ukraine. Here, Russia's longer-term advantage in reserves has begun to show. It is true Russia, in refusing to move its reserves from Donbass, has had to commit reserves from elsewhere in Russia, but it has such reserves. Ukraine does not. The Kursk offensive shows Ukraine has probably committed most of its remaining reserves to that front, and it had to move forces from Belarus, Kharkov, and Donbass for the Kursk offensive and to cut short training of newly drafted recruits. Ukraine is approaching the end of its human reserves and cannot get an increase in weapons and ammunition from NATO that it requires if the war intensifies as it is now in both Kursk and Donbass. But NATO has arranged continuing funding for Ukraine through 2025 by seizing Russia's 300 billion assets in G7 banks that were frozen at the outset of the war. But NATO's provision of weapons is slowing. Moreover, as NATO inventories are drying up, it can no longer accelerate delivery of weapons to Ukraine as it did in 2022-2023, nor politically does NATO have the will to provide soldiers on the ground directly into Ukraine, though it is building the largest military and air base in NATO now in eastern Romania, within tens of miles from Odessa, where it already has stationed thousands of French and U.S. airborne troops. If NATO does intervene ever on the ground, it will most likely be to prevent Russian seizure of the critical Ukraine seaport of Odessa, without which even a rump state of Ukraine in the West cannot be sustained. Six, so what is Russia's strategic options with regard to the Kursk invasion? Okay, and its Donbass offensive. Russian strategy will not change much, in the Donbass. It will continue to advance, likely even more rapidly, which has been going on, by the way. Ukraine's forces in Donbass may even collapse there before year end, with Ukraine retreating west to the Dnieper River and thus abandoning any hold on territory that comprises Russia's four provinces. And for the Kursk front, Russia will most likely seal off the currently occupying Ukrainian force, bring up new Russian armored division, artillery, and air forces, and continue to batter those Ukrainian forces in the pocket until they weaken and retreat of their own accord, which, by the way, is going on now. The word is that Ukraine is pulling out some of the forces in Kursk before they get trapped by the Russians. That will likely happen soon after the U.S. November elections. Ukraine will try to hold on to Kursk to try to ensure further U.S. support before Biden leaves office next January. The odds are significant, however, it will not be able to succeed in that. I think this is terrific analysis of what's going on in Kursk, by the way, and in Donbass, what's going on the military front. I'm surprised, that Jack Rasmus was able to do this analysis. It speaks well for the breadth of his knowledge. Public opinion in Russia has strengthened Putin's hand in the war as a consequence of the two offensives. His problem now is not ensuring Russian public opinion continues to support his government and the SMO, but that growing segments of Russian opinion and Russian media are now demanding he take even more aggressive action in response to the Kursk invasion. Putin's challenge now is to not fall for Ukraine's Kursk provocation, to abandon the SMO and escalate the conflict to an even more intensive and wider war. It would require a much larger military force than the SMO, and falling into the NATO warhawks trap to use a Russian escalation as an excuse to get NATO even more directly involved on the ground in the war than it already is. Zelensky clearly wants to maneuver events into that direction, i.e., a more direct Russian-NATO conflict. That's perhaps the major rationale behind the Kursk offensive. But Putin ultimately wants some kind of negotiated settlement, albeit on Russia's two terms announced earlier this summer. He will therefore likely wait till the outcome of U.S. elections to determine whether abandoning the SMO for a larger conflict is necessary. Zelensky and Ukraine leadership is desperate and reckless. Putin is calculating and typically factors in the bigger political picture. For the moment, however, Putin's conditions for beginning negotiations announced a couple of months ago, i.e. Ukraine leave the four provinces and agree to neutrality, is off the table, scuttling the possibility, of any negotiations with that China was trying to arrange last July. May also have been part of the objective of Ukraine's Kursk offensive. Ukraine and Zelensky have a long track record of feigning interest in actual negotiations as a cover for an escalation planned. Ukraine diplomatic maneuvers in Beijing in July and Qatar in August are evidence Ukraine has no intention of seriously negotiating anything. Quite the contrary. Although nothing is imminent, the U.S. and Russia may continue exploring the possibility of having negotiations through back channels, as they have in recent months. But it's clear there will be no negotiations of any kind until the U.S. elections at earliest, and more likely not until the Biden administration ends next January 20th, 2025. Throughout the summer, opinion has been growing among NATO elites and Western media that Ukraine cannot hold on to Donbass or even the four provinces annexed in 2022 by Russia. Russia's continuing successes in the Donbass offensives further confirm that view and solidify it should Russia take Pokrovsk next month, which I believe it's about to do. Conversely, NATO elite opinion may shift further toward allowing Ukraine to attack inside Russia using ATACMS cruise missiles and even F-16s to enable Ukraine to hold on to the Kursk territory as Ukraine loses the Donbass. Test of this NATO elite shift will be evident should U.S. allow in coming weeks further shipments of UK Storm Shadow cruise missiles to Ukraine. Losing the Donbass logically means rolling the military dice even further in Kursk, and the northern border. But I don't think they're going to be able to do that because I think the Russians are currently closing in on getting the Ukrainians out of Kursk altogether. I don't know if they'll have time to increase further shipments of missiles to Ukraine. But U.S. neocons and war hawks will attempt to create further escalation of the Ukraine war between now and January 2025 in order to make it extremely difficult for any new U.S. president elected in November to reduce U.S. NATO commitments to Ukraine, let alone withdraw. Should Harris win in November, the Biden administration's policies toward the war will almost certainly continue. Harris will be malleable to the foreign policy neocon establishment, which have been running U.S. foreign policy and war since at least 2001 and perhaps even earlier, since the late 1990s. Should Trump win and the deep state allow him to actually take office in January without a major U.S. constitutional crisis, which is more likely than not, it is unlikely that Trump will be able to end the Ukraine war in the short run after taking office on January 20th. Even with Trump in office, the war will continue well into 2025. The only factor that may expedite an earlier end of the war is if Russia debilitates the Ukraine military resource so much, to such an extent that those forces effectively collapse in both the Donbass and Kursk fronts. I think I'm seeing that right now. Russia has never intended to conquer all of Ukraine, including Kyiv. Putin's SMO has always been to drive Ukrainian forces out of the Russian-speaking province and then ensure some kind of neutrality by what's left of the Ukrainian state. But before that can happen, Russia will need to conclusively drive Ukraine back across the border from Kursk and take the strategic Donbass cities of Pokrovsk and Slavyansk. Only then is the endgame apparent. Only then will Ukraine forces retreat back to whatever remains of Ukraine. Only then will U.S. NATO decide to cut losses and abandon the Ukraine project altogether. So I think that's going to happen, and probably before the election. It remains to be seen, of course. We will have to see whether the end game in Ukraine, is upon us. I thought that was a very exacting and detailed analysis of the two offensives in the Ukraine war and what is likely to happen there. And it was a terrific article with lots of great information. So I hope that you appreciated that in spite of its length. There remains one more thing we're going to cover here tonight, but before we get to it, I'm going to look to see if we have any more comments and also look to see if that very, very lengthy thing actually held our audience. Well, we increased our audience, actually. There are 40 people here now, so Okay, I guess that's amazing. So Robert Copeland says California is a safe state, so I am voting for neither Harris or Trump. If I was in a safe state, Robert, I would also do exactly that. I would probably vote for Joe in that situation. Steve says, hello, Robert. And Steve says, happy anniversary. That's to us. Thank you, Steve. And Robert Copeland says, hi, everybody. And Steve says, Robert, I will not vote for Kamala. But you live in a safe state, Steve, so you can vote for Jill, which I hope you will do. Okay, it doesn't really matter if you vote for Trump because he will lose anyway. It's a safe state for Harris. So you might as well vote for the Green Party to try to give them a chance to reach the 5% mark. So D says happy anniversary. Thank you, D. And D says voting Jill Stein 2024. I think that D is also in a safe state and so is at liberty to vote for Jill Stein. I am not so lucky here, at least right now. There's a lead, okay, that Kamala has in this state of 7 points right now, but she is far from safe here. Robert says, so if Russia should be able to drive the Ukrainian army out of Russia with a 2-to-1 advantage, okay, in military forces, yeah, I think it should be. And Steve says 10% to the big guy. Ukraine is incredibly corrupt. Yes, it is. How many Russians have been, and it's not democratic at all. There's no democracy there. There's been a dictatorship there since the start of the war. How many Russians have been killed and injured per day in last month? I'm not sure, but I think it's a comparatively small amount. It's probably even 10% of the Ukrainian casualties. How many Russian fighters, bombers, fighters, and military helicopters have been destroyed? Okay, in the last year. I don't know the numbers of those, but I suggest to you that it has not been nearly enough to degrade the number of Russian fighters, bombers, fighters, and military helicopters over the last year because Russian production has more than kept pace in those material areas. Russia Black Sea Fleet has lost a lot of ships to a country that has no navy. I don't know what a lot means. I know it's lost at least 5 ships, but of course that doesn't really just that does not really address the situation on the ground, okay, and in the air. In other words, what Russia loses in terms of its Black Sea fleet is not important as long as the Russians are rolling up the Ukrainians on the ground. If Russia wins the war, then what are their future plans after the war? Nobody knows what the Russian military will do. Steve says, I am not voting for Jill Stein. Maybe vote for Cornel West then. Well, anyway, Steve, it's not my job to tell you who to vote for, so I'm not going to do it. Or I'm not going to do it any further. I did suggest voting for Jill Stein, but I'm not in the business of suggesting how people should vote. I'm in the business of telling people who they should vote against, not who they should vote for. So that leaves us now with our final piece of the day. It's very interesting because I think it is a measure of the total arrogance of U.S. foreign policy. This piece appeared in Common Dreams. There's a photo of Mexican President Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador speaking at a press conference at the National Palace in Mexico City on June 14th, 2024. Blasting U.S., quote, recklessness, but Mexico pauses embassy relations over judicial reform meddling. And quote from AMLO, they have to learn to respect Mexico's sovereignty, unquote, said Mexican President Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, said of the U.S. and Canada after their ambassadors weighed in on his controversial proposal. It may be controversial to us, but I doubt it's controversial to the Mexicans. This one was written by Brett Wilkins. It also dates from August 27th, 2024. Outgoing President Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, AMLO, put the embassies of the United States and Canada on timeout Tuesday after their top diplomats and other influential figures weighed in against controversial proposed reforms to Mexico's judicial system. Quote, the relationship with Ken Salazar is good, but it's on pause. We're going to give ourselves our time, unquote. AMLO said during his morning press conference referring to the U.S. ambassador. The president said the pause also applies to Canada, whose ambassador Graham Clark voiced alarm over the proposed reforms. Yeah, both of these people are ridiculous. These are internal proposals for reforming the Mexican judicial system. They're not the business of the United States or Canada. Quote from AMLO, they have to learn to respect Mexico's sovereignty because we're not going to give them advice there, nor to say that it is okay and what is wrong, unquote. He meant that people in Mexico are not going to interfere in U.S. elections or U.S. proposed judicial reforms here. What would we think if Mexico said, if we decided to expand the Supreme Court and Mexico had its embassies objecting to the reform because they like the Supreme Court as it is. They liked a 6-3 majority of these idiot conservatives. What will we do if that happens? We'd probably send missiles Mexico's way. Quote, they have to learn to respect Mexico's sovereignty because we're not going to give them advice there in order to say that it is okay and what is wrong, unquote, he added. Quote, we want them to be respectful. There is a reciprocal relationship in terms of sovereignty. Boy, is he right. Is he so right about that? So right. AMLO's move came after Salazar, that's our ambassador to Mexico, asserted last week that, quote, popular direct election of judges is a major risk to the function of Mexico's democracy, unquote, says the ambassador from the Colossus of the North, who is, to say the least, having a few problems with its own freaking democracy. Right now, Mexico is a good deal more democratic than the United States. At least the people's choices are winning there. Quote, we understand the importance of Mexico's fight against judicial corruption, but direct election of judges, in my view, would not address judicial corruption, nor would it strengthen the judicial branch of government, unquote, the ambassador continued. Who cares what your view is? Quote, it would also weaken the efforts to make North American economic integration a reality and would create turbulence as the debate over direct election will continue over the next several years, quote. Oh boy, is AMLO polite. If I was in his position, I would long since have used some carefully chosen obscenities. Quote, I believe faith and trust in the rule of law are one of the many shared values which unite our nations. Yeah, faith and trust in the rule of law. What rule of law?
Which one?
Are we talking about the rule of law that has left Trump free for so many months after he encouraged an insurrection against the United States? You mean that rule of law? Or the rule of law that gives the rich a tremendous advantage in trials, okay, in our nation? Or are we talking about, shall we say, the rule of international law, which we break every single goddamn day? Give me a break. Clark subsequently said that Canadian, quote, investors are concerned. They want stability. They want a judicial system that works if there are problems, unquote. What they want is a judicial system in Mexico that works for them. And American investors the same. These two ambassadors are trying to protect the investors from their country in Mexico. And AMLO is trying to protect his country from these investors undermining the will of the people in Mexico. AMLO accused the ambassadors of recklessness, quote unquote, during his Tuesday press conference, adding that, quote, there are things that only concern our country, unquote. It's not just the ambassadors. On Tuesday, U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee Chair Ben Cardin, ranking member James Risch, who's from Idaho, he's a Republican from Idaho, and Senators Tim Kaine, Democrat of Virginia, and Marco Rubio, Republican of Florida, said in a joint statement that they are deeply concerned, this is a quotation, quote, are deeply concerned that the proposed judicial reforms in Mexico would undermine the independence and transparency of the country's judiciary, jeopardizing critical economic and security interests shared by our two nations. Maybe these interests are not shared by the people of the two nations. I mean, ever think of that, buddy? What do the people of Mexico want? Do they want to see certain restraints put on the investors from the Colossus of the North, maybe? Quote, we are also alarmed that several other constitutional reforms currently under discussion may contradict commitments made in the U.S. Mexico-Canada trade agreement, which is scheduled for review in 2026, unquote. Okay, the senators added. Well, the constitutional reforms in Mexico may contradict commitments, but guess what? You know what? Constitutional requirements in any country are superior in law to trade agreements. Trade agreements stand pretty high. They're the domestic laws of the various countries that have entered into the trade agreements. But any constitutional changes always have higher priority in law. That includes constitutional changes here in the United States or even constitutional commitments here in the United States. The Global Enterprise Council, the Mexico City-based lobbyist for 63 multinational corporations operating in Mexico, including Walmart, American Express, AT&T, General Motors, Microsoft, and ExxonMobil, is also opposing the proposed judicial reforms, as are other organizations, including the New York City Bar Association and the Washington Post editorial board. Kurt Hackbarth said on Twitter, imperial mindsets never rest. Per the at Washington Post, Mexico's judicial reform is not an internal affair, but one the U.S. has every right to comment on. No, it is an internal reform. It is an internal affair. Are we giving Mexico the right to interfere in our judicial reforms? I mean, what kind of nut says that it's not a Mexican internal affair? Thus, Mexican ambassador Esteban Moctezuma has the same right to comment on Biden's judicial reform. How would that go over. Uh, anyway, he denounced Salazar's unfortunate and prudent statement, which amounted to, quote, a lack of respect for our sovereignty. The Mexican Foreign Ministry sent a letter chastising the United States for intruding on topics, quote, that are strictly the internal affairs of the Mexican state. But, the Washington Post said, they are not, though, at stake of judicial independence and the rule of law in a country that has known too little of either during its long history. But they still are internal affairs of the Mexican state. They are about reforms that are being considered by the people of Mexico. And what the people of Mexico do is not our business. And our notion of judicial independence may not be the same notion that the people of Mexico has. Our notion of judicial independence means that we have a Supreme Court that is unconstrained, including unconstrained in its ability to take unlimited donations from the rich, which make it independent of we the people, but also dependent on the extremely rich and the corporations. So, what kind of judicial independence do we have here these days? How dare we talk about dangers to judicial independence in Mexico? This is freaking ridiculous. Lopez Obrador's Plan C, quote unquote, proposes a sweeping overhaul of Mexico's corruption ridden judiciary. It's already sounding good to me. The plan's most controversial reform would make judges at all levels of the judiciary, who are currently appointed, elected officials. All current sitting judges would be up for election in 2025 and 2027. Why don't we do that here, folks? Why don't we do that here? We can see if the 6 Republican judges on the court survive elections after what they did in Dobbs. Somehow, I don't believe they would survive elections, nor should they survive elections. What they have been doing in that Supreme Court is profoundly anti-democratic. Profoundly anti. They've been undermining our democracy. We need election of our Supreme Court judges. That's what we need. The president argues these reforms are necessary to combat corruption and impunity in Mexico's judicial system. He has accused Mexican Supreme Court justices of being, quote, supporters of the oligarchy, not of democracy, unquote. I mean, that's completely applicable here, and says they oppose Plan C because, quote, they do not want a government of the people. He's right. He's on the money. Plan C, which came after an earlier proposal was blocked by the Supreme Court, has sparked nationwide protests by opponents who say Lopez Obrador is trying to weaken, the judiciary and the National Electoral Institute and entrench his ruling Morena party, as former Mexico City Mayor Claudia Sheinbaum, a close ally of the president, prepares to replace him on October 1st after winning June's election in a landslide. Tensions between Mexico and the United States have been mounting for months over Mexican perceptions of U.S. meddling, including dubiously timed corporate media reports of alleged links between Lopez Obrador and drug cartels. Last week, AMLO said that Salazar's statement, quote, expressing a position on the strictly domestic matter of the Mexican state represents unacceptable interference, contravenes the sovereignty of the United Mexican States, and does not reflect the degree of mutual respect that characterizes the relations between our governments, unquote. Quote, this is an overtly interventionist attitude. I hope it does not happen again, unquote. In separate remarks last week, Lopez Obrador also accused the U.S. of funding organizations working to undermine the Mexican government under the guise of human rights. For example, the U.S. Agency for International Development, AID, whose decades-long history of meddling in Latin America runs the gamut from kidnapping and torturing unhoused Uruguayans to death for instructional purposes to an attempt at toppling Cuba's revolutionary government by infiltrating the island's hip-hop scene, has financially supported Mexicans against corruption and impunity, a frequent critic of the AMLO administration. During his Tuesday press conference, AMLO reminded Mexicans of centuries of U.S. aggression and meddling in Mexico's internal affairs. Quote, for many years, the United States has applied an interventionist policy throughout America ever since it established the Monroe Doctrine, unquote, he said. But Lopez Obrador recounted how Mexico lost half its territory as a result of the 1846-48 U.S. invasion carried out on false pretexts, decried by a young congressman from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln, and endured 7 months of U.S. occupation of Veracruz in 1914. Yes, I guess we have to remind people that half the territory that was lost as a result of the invasion of 1846 to 48 included such states as New Mexico, California, I believe, I don't know whether Oregon was included in that, but it was huge territories, Arizona, also New Mexico. I don't know whether Colorado was included in that or not, or whether Colorado was included, in the Louisiana Purchase. But a large portion of the United States, perhaps a quarter of the United States, was acquired as a result of the invasion of 1846 to 48. The president stressed that having trade agreements with the U.S. does not mean that Washington has the right to meddle in Mexican affairs. Quote, the treaty is not for us to cede our sovereignty. The treaty is about trade, about forging good economic and commercial ties that suit both nations, unquote, he said Tuesday. Quote, but that doesn't mean Mexico must become an appendix, a colony, or a protectorate, unquote, of the United States. So when I read that, I just thought that the U.S. actions in that instance were outrageous. They are the kinds of actions that should never happen if we had a decent and collaborative foreign policy. We just need to shut up when it comes to the internal affairs of other nations. I should put that even more strongly. We need to shut the fuck up when it comes to the policies, the internal policies, of other nations. This is up to the people, of those nations. Steve says, well, I have to go to bed. Good night, everyone. Okay, good night, Steve. Joe, a lot of people that I know say we should vote for Kamala Harris so we will get Donald Trump. And those people might be right where there are close races in one's state. But where there are not close races, as there will not be in California, it doesn't matter uh, whether you vote for a third party. I mean, it matters to the third party because it gets them closer to the 5%. Steve Wolfbrand said, well, I have to get to bed. Good night, everyone. I understand that as well. I have to get to bed before long also. And so if there are no more comments, okay, I think that I'm going to have to get to bed pretty soon as well. Joe, the people live in California. Well, the people who live in California are wrong. As long as the state is not close, as long as Donald Trump is sure but to lose the state to Harris, then people should feel perfectly free to vote for a third party if they prefer the candidates and platforms of that third party. Okay, did you say you wanted to vote for Jill Stein? I don't know. I don't remember seeing that, Robert, but if you did say that, that's perfectly okay with me. I would probably do the same here if things were not close. Unfortunately, I think things are too close here, and that I will have to vote for Harris in spite of my complete contempt for her foreign policy. So I am stuck. I'm glad, Robert, that you have the freedom to vote for somebody other than those two. Steve has that freedom too. I hope he makes good use of it. And on that note, I'm going to say good night. Thank you all for coming. I think attendance, was pretty good tonight. I'm looking forward also to good attendance on Thursday. I already know what I'm going to do on Thursday unless something intervenes there. On Thursday, I'm going to talk about I'll be talking about what's going on, in Israel. I'm going to be talking some about Ukraine. I'll be talking about the arrest, of the owner, of Telegram, specifically Durov in France. And I'll be talking about how Karbala, in Iraq, is the past, is the path to Al-Aqsa in Palestine. Specifically, of course, Al-Aqsa is the Arabic term for Jerusalem. So the articles that are involved are authored by Pepe Escobar, and by Alistair Crook, if I recall correctly. Yes, by Alistair Crook as well. So I'll see you for that show on international relations on Thursday, hopefully. Then I'll be doing some domestic stuff on Saturday. So good night, everyone. Hope you have a good night and a great day tomorrow.